They say coming home should feel like a sanctuary, but standing in the parking lot of Blackwater Military Academy's ceremonial hall, all I felt was the weight of 7 years' worth of unspoken accusations. My name is Captain Sarah Mitchell, though tonight I wasn't wearing anything that would announce that fact to the world. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The invitation had been forwarded to me through 3 different email addresses before finally reaching the secure server I checked twice weekly. Captain David Mitchell, promotion ceremony it read. My younger brother finally making major at 28. The same rank I'd held at his age before everything changed. I adjusted the collar of my civilian blazer and checked my reflection in the car window one last time. No ribbons, no insignia, nothing that would give away what I'd become in the years since I'd walked away from this place. The woman staring back at me looked tired, weathered in ways that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with the kind of work that doesn't appear on official records. The Blackwater Academy's Hamilton Hall stood like a monument to military tradition, its brick facade illuminated by warm golden lights that made everything look softer than it really was. Through the tall windows, I could see silhouettes moving against the light, officers in dress blues, family members in their finest clothes, everyone gathered to celebrate my brother's achievement. Everyone except the person who should have been proudest. I hadn't spoken to my father in over 2 years. Colonel James Mitchell, retired, former commandant of this very academy, the man who'd raised us both to believe that honor and duty were worth more than breath itself. The same man who'd looked me in the eye 7 years ago and told me I was a disappointment to the family name. The night air carried the sound of laughter and conversation through the heavy wooden doors. I could pick out my brother's voice even from 50 yards away. Confident, warm, everything a military leader should sound like. David had always been the golden child, the one who did everything by the book, who never questioned orders or pushed boundaries. Unlike me. I walked slowly toward the entrance, my heels clicking against the concrete in a rhythm that reminded me of marching cadence. But tonight, I wasn't marching with anyone. I was walking alone, just as I had been for the past 7 years. The doorman nodded politely as I approached, his eyes scanning my civilian clothes with barely concealed confusion. Family members got special treatment at military functions, but I clearly didn't fit the usual mold. No spouse's pin, no proud parent smile, just a woman in a dark suit who looked like she belonged somewhere else entirely. Good evening, ma'am. Name for the guest list? Sarah Mitchell. He ran his finger down the printed list, pausing when he found my name near the bottom. There was a small notation next to it that I couldn't read from my angle, but his expression shifted slightly. More respectful, but also more cautious. Of course, Ms. Mitchell, right this way. The interior of Hamilton Hall hadn't changed much since my cadet days. The same oil paintings of distinguished graduates lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow visitors as they passed. The same polished hardwood floors reflected the light from crystal chandeliers that had hung here since the Academy's founding in 1847. But what struck me most wasn't what had stayed the same, it was what was different. The faces were younger now, the uniforms slightly updated, the conversations peppered with references to conflicts and missions that hadn't existed when I was here. The military had moved on without me, evolved and adapted while I'd been doing work that officially didn't exist. I spotted David immediately. He stood near the center of the room, his new major's oak leaves gleaming on his shoulders, surrounded by a circle of admiring colleagues and family friends. His wife Amanda stood beside him in a navy blue dress that perfectly complemented his uniform. They looked like a recruitment poster, young, successful, everything the modern military couple should be. And there, holding court near the bar, was my father. Colonel James Mitchell, even in retirement, commanded attention without trying. At 62, he still carried himself with the bearing of a man who'd spent 40 years making life-or-death decisions. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his civilian suit pressed to military standards. He was telling a story to a group of younger officers, gesturing with his whiskey glass in a way that made everyone lean in closer. I recognized the story. It was about a training exercise from his days as a company commander, back when he was building the reputation that would eventually make him one of the most respected leaders in his generation. I'd heard it a dozen times growing up, had watched him refine and perfect it over the years, until it became less memory and more performance art. He hadn't seen me yet. Neither had David. I stood near the entrance, technically part of the gathering but separate from it, like a ghost haunting the edges of my own family's celebration. The servers moved through the crowd with practiced efficiency, offering champagne and hors d'oeuvre to guests who barely noticed them. This was their world. Military families who understood the unspoken rules, who knew how to navigate the complex social hierarchies that existed within the service. Everyone here belonged, had earned their place through years of sacrifice and dedication. Everyone except me. I made my way to the bar, ordering a club soda from a bartender who looked like he might have been a cadet himself not too long ago. As I waited, I caught fragments of conversations around me. Talk of deployments and promotions, of children following in their parents' footsteps, of traditions being passed down through generations of military families. Sarah? I turned to find Amanda approaching, her smile bright but uncertain. David's wife had always been kind to me, even after everything that happened. She was one of the few people who'd never asked for details about why I'd left, never pushed for explanations I couldn't give. I wasn't sure you'd come, she said, reaching out to touch my arm gently. David will be so happy to see you. Congratulations are in order, I replied, keeping my voice neutral. Major Mitchell has a nice ring to it. He's been working toward this for so long. Her eyes searched my face, looking for something I wasn't sure I could give her. How are you doing? We haven't heard from you in months. Before I could answer, the conversation around us began to shift. The casual chatter was giving way to something more formal, more ceremonial. Someone was calling for attention, preparing to begin the evening's official program. I looked across the room and saw my father setting down his glass, preparing to take his place at the small podium that had been set up near the front windows. Of course, he would be the one giving the speech. Even retired, even technically no longer part of the chain of command, James Mitchell was still the patriarch of this particular military dynasty. Our eyes met across the crowded room, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. 7 years of silence passed between us in that single glance. 7 years of unasked questions and unspoken accusations. 7 years of a daughter who'd disappeared into shadows, and a father who'd convinced himself that was exactly where she belonged. He looked away first, turning his attention to the speech cards in his hand. But I saw something in his expression that I hadn't expected: uncertainty. As if my presence here tonight had shifted some calculation he'd been making, introduced a variable he hadn't planned for. The room began to quiet as people found their seats or gathered closer to the front. Amanda squeezed my arm once before moving toward David, leaving me standing alone near the back of the crowd. My father stepped up to the podium, his voice carrying easily across the room without amplification. Ladies and gentlemen, family and friends, we gather tonight to celebrate not just a promotion, but a tradition. The tradition of service that defines the Mitchell family and has defined American military excellence for generations. I stayed where I was, listening to words I'd heard variations of my entire life. Words about duty and honor, about sacrifice and dedication, about young men and women who answered their country's call without hesitation. But as he spoke, I found myself thinking about the questions he wasn't asking, the stories he wasn't telling. The daughter who'd also answered that call, who'd also served with distinction, who'd also sacrificed everything for her country. The daughter he'd written off as a failure because she'd made choices he couldn't understand, choices that had taken her down paths he couldn't follow. Tonight, standing in the shadows of my brother's celebration, I wondered if it was finally time for Colonel James Mitchell to learn just how wrong he'd been about his daughter's capacity for service. After all, some secrets have a way of surfacing when you least expect them. My father's speech continued, his voice filling every corner of Hamilton Hall with the kind of authority that had shaped 2 generations of Mitchell children. But I wasn't listening to his words anymore. Instead, I was watching the faces around me, cataloging reactions, noting who nodded at which phrases and who seemed genuinely moved versus professionally obligated to appear interested. Old habits die hard. 7 years of intelligence work had taught me to read rooms differently than most people, to see patterns and connections that others missed. Tonight, surrounded by my brother's colleagues and my father's former students, I was unconsciously mapping relationships and power structures like I was preparing a briefing. The irony wasn't lost on me. The skills that had made me invaluable to my current handlers were the same skills that had gotten me expelled from this world in the first place. The ability to see what others couldn't, to question what everyone else accepted, to make connections that challenged established narratives. Major Mitchell represents everything we hope to instill in our officers, my father was saying, gesturing toward David with obvious pride. Leadership through example, integrity under pressure, and the wisdom to know when following orders serves the greater good. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. That last phrase hit like a physical blow. I felt my jaw tighten involuntarily, my hands curling into fists at my sides. The greater good. As if he had any idea what that phrase really meant, what it cost to serve it when no one was watching, when there would be no ceremonies or congratulations waiting at the end. A movement near the front caught my attention. An older man in a civilian suit had entered through a side door, moving with the careful precision of someone trying not to draw attention to himself. But I recognized that walk, that bearing. Once a soldier, always a soldier, no matter what clothes you put on. He was scanning the crowd, his eyes moving methodically from face to face like he was looking for someone specific. When his gaze reached me, it stopped. For a long moment we simply stared at each other across the room, two people who clearly recognized something in each other that didn't quite fit the civilian setting. Then his expression changed. Surprise, followed by something that looked almost like recognition? But that was impossible. I'd never seen this man before in my life, and I was certain I would have remembered him. There was something about his presence that suggested authority, experience, the kind of background that left permanent marks on how a person carried themselves. My father's speech was winding down, moving into the formal presentation portion of the evening. David stepped forward to receive a ceremonial plaque, his smile genuine and warm as he shook hands with the Academy's current commandant. The crowd applauded, cameras flashed, and for a moment everything felt normal and celebratory. That's when the older man began moving toward me. He walked with purpose but without urgency, weaving through the crowd like he belonged here but wasn't quite part of it. As he got closer, I could see more details. Late 60s, gray hair cropped military short, eyes that missed nothing. There were small pins on his lapel that I couldn't make out from a distance, but something about them suggested service decorations translated into civilian wear. "Excuse me," he said when he reached me, his voice pitched low enough that only I could hear over the ongoing applause. "I hope you don't mind the interruption, but I believe we have a mutual acquaintance." I kept my expression neutral, professional. "I'm not sure what you mean." He smiled, but it wasn't entirely friendly. "Colonel Patricia Hawkins sends her regards. She mentioned I might run into you here." The name hit me like ice water. Colonel Hawkins was my handler, the woman who'd recruited me out of my disgrace 7 years ago and turned me into something the military needed but could never officially acknowledge. There were maybe 6 people in the world who knew about my connection to her, and none of them should have been at my brother's promotion ceremony. "I think you have me confused with someone else," I said carefully. "Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell," he continued, his voice still low but carrying absolute certainty. 29 years old. Graduated top 15% of your class at Blackwater Academy. Specialized in tactical intelligence and counter-surveillance. Officially resigned your commission in 2017 following an incident during a training exercise. My blood turned to ice. This wasn't just recognition, this was a full briefing being recited back to me. Someone had done their homework, and done it thoroughly. "Unofficially," he continued, "recruited into the Phantom Division 3 weeks after your resignation. Current rank classified, current assignment classified, current location officially non-existent." I forced myself to breathe normally, to maintain the same neutral expression I'd worn since he approached, but inside alarm bells were screaming. The Phantom Division wasn't something you talked about at cocktail parties. It wasn't something you talked about anywhere, with anyone, ever. You seem to know a lot about a person who doesn't exist, I said. Master Sergeant William Torres retired, he said, extending his hand. Though most people who knew me back in the day called me Sergeant Major Torres. I had the pleasure of serving under your father during his second deployment in Afghanistan. The pieces began clicking into place. Torres? I'd heard that name before in stories my father told when I was younger. His senior non-commissioned officer. The man he'd trusted with his life. And the lives of his soldiers. They'd served together for almost 3 years. Through some of the most dangerous operations of that particular deployment. But that still didn't explain how he knew about my current situation, or why Colonel Hawkins would have told him anything about me. Your father thinks you're working private security in Denver, Torres continued, his eyes never leaving my face. Tells people you couldn't handle military life, that you found something more suited to your limited capabilities. The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking. Even after all these years, even knowing exactly what my father thought of me, hearing it stated so matter-of-factly by a stranger was like being slapped. Is there a point to this conversation, Sergeant Major? The point, he said, his voice taking on a sharper edge, is that Colonel Hawkins thought it was time someone set the record straight. She's been watching your family for a while now, particularly your father's tendency to rewrite history when it suits his narrative. Before I could respond, the crowd around us began to shift again. The formal ceremony was ending, people were starting to mingle and congratulate David personally. In a few minutes, this entire conversation would become much more difficult to maintain privately. There's going to be a moment tonight, Torres continued, when your father's version of events gets challenged. When it does, you'll have a choice to make. You can stay hidden, let his lies continue to define who you are, or you can let the truth speak for itself. What truth? The truth is that Major Sarah Mitchell never resigned her commission, he said quietly. She was transferred, with full honors, into a program so classified that even her father's security clearance doesn't reach high enough to know it exists. The room seemed to tilt around me. I'm not. Major Mitchell, he said, and for the first time since he'd approached me, his voice carried the unmistakable tone of military respect. With all due respect, ma'am, your father has been living a lie for 7 years. Colonel Hawkins thinks it's time that lie got corrected. Across the room, I could see my father beginning to move in our direction, probably curious about who I was talking to. David was still surrounded by well-wishers, but he kept glancing over at me with a concerned expression. Why now? I asked. Torres smiled, and this time it was genuinely warm. Because, Major, tomorrow morning your father is scheduled to give a guest lecture at the War College on leadership lessons from failed commands. He's planning to use your situation as his primary case study. The audacity of it was staggering. Using my supposed failure as a teaching tool, turning my sacrifice into a cautionary tale for future officers. After everything I'd given up, everything I'd endured to serve my country in ways he couldn't even imagine, he was planning to make me the poster child for military incompetence. Colonel Hawkins thought you should know, Torres continued, and she thought you might want to attend that lecture, as his guest. I watched my father approaching, saw the moment he recognized Torres, saw his expression shift from curiosity to genuine pleasure. These two men had shared something profound during their deployment together, had forged the kind of bond that only combat could create. But only one of them knew the whole truth about Colonel James Mitchell's daughter. Sergeant Major Torres! My father called out, his voice carrying across the crowd. I'll be damned! What brings you to Virginia? Torres turned to greet him, but before he did, he pressed something small and metallic into my palm. I glanced down quickly and saw a military challenge coin, the kind units gave to their members as a sign of belonging and recognition. But this one was different. Instead of a unit insignia, it bore a simple star and the words, Phantom Division, Service Above Self. Think about it, Major, Torres murmured as my father reached us. Some truths are too important to stay buried forever. Bill Torres, you old warhorse. My father's voice boomed with genuine warmth as he clasped the sergeant major's hand in both of his. I heard you'd finally hung up your boots. About time. You were making the rest of us look bad by staying in shape. Torres laughed, the sound easy and natural. Retirement's been good to me, Colonel. Though I have to say, civilian life takes some getting used to. No one tells you where to be or when to be there. I imagine that's quite an adjustment for someone who spent 30 years following orders. My father's eyes flicked to me briefly, then back to Torres. I don't believe you've met my daughter, Sarah. The moment stretched like a held breath. Torres extended his hand to me with perfect military courtesy. But there was something in his expression that suggested he was enjoying this more than he should. Ms. Mitchell, he said formally, your father's told me so much about you over the years. I shook his hand, feeling the challenge coin he'd pressed into my palm moments earlier. Has he? Oh yes, Torres continued, his voice taking on a conversational tone that somehow managed to sound both innocent and loaded with meaning. Just the other day, in fact, he was telling me about your career transition. Private security work, wasn't it? My father's chest puffed slightly with what I recognized as his lecture mode engaging. Sarah found that military life wasn't quite the right fit for her temperament. She's done much better in the civilian sector, haven't you, sweetheart? The endearment stung more than any insult could have, delivered with that particular tone of paternal condescension that suggested I was a child who'd needed to be redirected toward more appropriate activities. The private sector has its challenges, I said carefully. I'm sure it does, Torres replied. Though I have to say, Colonel, your description of Sarah's departure from the service was interesting, especially given what I know about similar situations. Something shifted in my father's expression. A slight tightening around his eyes, the kind of micro-expression that suggested he was trying to figure out where this conversation was heading. Similar situations? Well, you know how it is in our line of work, Torres said easily. Sometimes the most capable soldiers end up in positions where their families can't know the details of what they're doing. For security reasons, of course. I felt my pulse quicken. Torres was walking a very thin line here, dancing right up to the edge of classified information without actually crossing it. But the implication was clear enough that anyone with military experience would understand what he was suggesting. I'm not sure I follow, my father said, though his tone suggested he was beginning to. Oh, I think you do, sir. After all, you spent enough time in Afghanistan to know that not every mission makes it into the official after-action reports. Not every soldier's contribution gets public recognition. Torres paused, letting that sink in. Sometimes the most important work happens in the shadows. The conversation around us had continued, but I noticed David glancing over more frequently now. Amanda had moved closer as well, probably sensing tension even if she couldn't hear the specifics of what we were discussing. Sergeant Major, my father said, his voice taking on the authoritative edge I remembered from childhood. I'm not sure what you're implying, but I'm not implying anything, Colonel. I'm stating facts. Torres's tone remained respectful but firm. The fact is, sometimes families have to live with incomplete information about their loved one's service. Sometimes that incomplete information gets misinterpreted. My father looked directly at me for the first time since Torres had arrived. Sarah, what is he talking about? Before I could answer, David appeared on my father's shoulder. Dad, is everything all right? You look a little tense. Everything's fine, my father said without taking his eyes off me. We're just having an interesting conversation about career paths. David smiled uncertainly. Well, when you're ready, the photographer wants to get some family shots. Amanda's already picked out the perfect spot by the Academy seal. In a moment, my father said dismissively. Then, to Torres, Bill, I think there might be some confusion here about... No confusion at all, sir. Torres reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small leather folder. Just thought you might be interested in this. He opened the folder to reveal what looked like an official military photograph. From my angle, I couldn't see the details, but I watched my father's face as he looked at it. Confusion, then surprise, then something that looked almost like fear. Where did you get this? My father asked quietly. Official channels, Torres replied. Turns out they keep very thorough records of all their personnel, even the ones whose work requires discretion. My father's hand trembled slightly as he held the photograph. David moved closer, trying to see what had captured his attention so completely. Dad, what is it? It's... My father started, then stopped. His eyes moved from the photograph to me, then back to the photograph. This can't be right. Oh, it's right, Torres said firmly. Promoted to major 2 years ago, actually. Outstanding service record, multiple commendations for exceptional performance in challenging circumstances. The words hit my father like physical blows. I watched him process the information, saw the moment when the implications began to sink in. 7 years of believing his own narrative, 7 years of telling anyone who would listen that his daughter had failed, had lacked the strength and discipline for military service. "Sarah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "is this true?" I looked around at the faces watching us. David, confused but concerned. Amanda, clearly picking up on the tension even if she didn't understand its source. Torres, waiting to see how I would handle this moment. And my father, looking older than I'd ever seen him, holding a photograph that was apparently rewriting everything he thought he knew about his daughter. "Yes," I said simply. "But you left. You resigned your commission. You said—" I said what I was told to say. The words came out harder than I'd intended. What I was required to say to protect operational security. David stepped forward, his expression shifting from confusion to something approaching alarm. "Sarah, what are you talking about? What operational security?" Before I could answer, Torres spoke up. "Your sister serves in a capacity that requires her family to believe she left the military. For everyone's protection, including yours." "Serves?" David repeated. "Present tense?" I nodded slowly. "Present tense." My father was still staring at the photograph, his hands shaking now with what I realized was not fear but rage. "You let me believe. For 7 years you let me tell people that you had failed, that you couldn't handle the pressure, that you were weak. It was necessary." "Necessary?" His voice was rising now, drawing attention from other guests. "I used you as an example. I taught classes about failed leadership using your case as—" He stopped abruptly, his face going pale. "Using my case as what, Dad?" Torres cleared his throat gently. "Perhaps this conversation would be better continued somewhere more private?" But my father wasn't listening. He was looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of horror and dawning comprehension. "The lecture," he whispered. "Tomorrow morning, the War College." "What lecture?" David asked. My father didn't answer. He was still staring at me, and I could see him putting together the pieces, understanding finally what he had almost done, what he would have done if Torres hadn't intervened tonight. "You were going to use me as your primary case study," I said quietly, "weren't you? The daughter who couldn't cut it, who cracked under pressure, who proved that not everyone is suited for military leadership." The silence that followed was deafening. Around us, the celebration continued, but our small group had become an island of tension in the middle of the festivities. "I didn't know," my father said finally, his voice breaking. "Sarah, I swear to God, I didn't know." "No," I replied, feeling 7 years of buried anger finally surfacing. "You didn't know because you never asked. You just assumed. You wrote the story that made sense to you and never questioned whether it might be true." The challenge coin Torres had given me was still in my palm, its edges sharp against my skin. Physical proof of a truth that had been hidden for too long, carried by too few people. "Well," Torres said into the heavy silence, "I believe those family photos are still waiting." The family photos were a disaster. Amanda tried her best to maintain some semblance of celebration, positioning us near the Academy seal with professional determination. But the photographer couldn't capture what wasn't there. David stood rigid beside me, still processing everything he'd just learned. My father looked like he'd aged a decade in the past 10 minutes, his usual commanding presence replaced by something hollow and uncertain. "Perhaps we should try a more casual arrangement," the photographer suggested after the third attempt, clearly sensing the tension radiating from our group. "No," my father said quietly. "I think we're done here." He walked away without another word, leaving the rest of us standing awkwardly in front of the Academy's most prominent symbol. The irony wasn't lost on me. The seal bore the motto, "Honor above all," and we were quite literally standing in its shadow while confronting 7 years of dishonor. "Sarah," David said once the photographer had moved on to other families, "we need to talk, really talk." "Not here," I replied, watching our father disappear through the crowd toward the exit. "Too many ears." Amanda touched my arm gently. "There's a conference room on the second floor. It should be empty tonight." We made our way upstairs, Torres following silently behind us like a bodyguard. The conference room Amanda led us to was small and windowless, furnished with a single oval table and 8 chairs. Maps of famous military campaigns hung on the walls, their battle lines and troop movements, a stark reminder of the strategic thinking that had shaped generations of officers. David closed the door behind us and immediately turned to face me. "Start from the beginning. And I mean the real beginning, not whatever sanitized version you've been feeding us for 7 years." I sat down heavily in one of the chairs, suddenly feeling exhausted. The adrenaline from the confrontation downstairs was wearing off, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness that had nothing to do with physical fatigue. "The training exercise that supposedly ended my career," I began, "wasn't a training exercise. It was a live operation disguised as training to maintain plausible deniability." Torres nodded approvingly. "Standard protocol for certain types of missions. We were supposed to be conducting reconnaissance on a suspected weapons cache near the Pakistani border. Intelligence suggested the site was abandoned, but when we arrived, there were civilians in the area. Children playing near what we thought was an empty compound." David's expression grew more serious. "What happened?" "Our commanding officer ordered us to proceed with the mission regardless. Said the intelligence was solid and the civilians weren't our concern." I could still remember the weight of that moment, the split second when training and conscience had collided. I countermanded the order, pulled my team back, and called for civilian evacuation support. "Jesus," Amanda whispered. "The weapons cache was real," I continued, "but so were the civilians. If we'd proceeded as ordered, 12 people would have died, including 5 children under the age of 10. The after-action report should have noted that my decision prevented a humanitarian disaster." "Should have," Torres emphasized. "But that would have required acknowledging that the original intelligence was flawed and the commanding officer had made a catastrophic error in judgment." David was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. "So they blamed you instead. They needed a scapegoat. Someone to take responsibility for the failure of the mission, even though the real failure would have been following orders that led to civilian casualties." I looked directly at David. Dad was part of the review board that recommended my dismissal. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Amanda's hand went to her mouth, and David's face went pale. "He knew?" David asked. "He knew the real circumstances and still. He knew exactly what happened. He read the classified reports, interviewed the witnesses, reviewed the intelligence failures. And then he chose to support the official narrative that painted me as insubordinate and unreliable." Torres pulled out his phone and began scrolling through what looked like official documents. "Colonel Hawkins had me pull the original review board transcripts. Your father's comments are illuminating." He turned the phone toward us, and I saw my father's official statement from 7 years ago. "Lieutenant Mitchell's actions, while perhaps well-intentioned, demonstrate a fundamental inability to follow orders under pressure. This kind of independent thinking, however morally motivated, is incompatible with military discipline and the chain of command. I recommend immediate dismissal to prevent similar incidents in the future." David read the statement twice, his jaw tightening with each word. "He threw you under the bus to protect the chain of command." "It gets worse," Torres said, scrolling to another section. 3 weeks after your dismissal, there was an internal review of the intelligence failure that led to the mission parameters. The reviewing officer recommended policy changes to prevent similar situations." "Let me guess," I said bitterly. "Dad was one of the officers who blocked those recommendations." "Not just blocked them. He argued that the mission planning was sound and that the fault lay entirely with field personnel, who lacked the discipline to execute orders as given." Torres looked up from his phone. "He used your case as evidence that the problem was with individual soldiers, not systemic issues." Amanda had been quietly listening, but now she spoke up. How could he live with himself, knowing what really happened? "Because he convinced himself that his version was true," I replied. "He had to." The alternative would have meant admitting that he chose institutional loyalty over his own daughter's honor. David stood abruptly and began pacing the small room. "So when you resigned your commission?" "I was recruited the same day by Colonel Hawkins. The Phantom Division needed someone with my particular skill set. Someone who could think independently under pressure. Someone who valued mission success over political convenience." "And Dad never knew?" "Dad never wanted to know. As far as he was concerned, I was a problem that had been solved. Dismissed, discredited, and no longer his responsibility." Torres pocketed his phone. "Which brings us to tomorrow's lecture at the War College. Your father has been using your case study for 3 years now, teaching future commanders about the dangers of insubordination and the importance of following orders regardless of personal feelings." The room fell silent as the full implications sank in. My father hadn't just failed me 7 years ago. He'd been actively using my supposed failure to shape military doctrine, to teach other officers that questioning orders was weakness rather than wisdom. "How many officers have heard that lecture?" David asked quietly. "Approximately 300, Torres replied, "including several who are now serving in command positions overseas." I felt sick. How many missions had been carried out by officers who'd been taught that my approach was wrong? How many commanders had ignored civilian safety concerns because they'd been told that such considerations were evidence of weak leadership? "We have to stop the lecture," Amanda said firmly. "We have to tell them the truth." "It's not that simple," I replied. "Most of what I've told you tonight is still classified. I can't just walk into the War College and start revealing operational details." "But Torres can," David pointed out. "He's retired military with appropriate clearances. He could speak on your behalf." Torres shook his head. "That would only solve part of the problem. The bigger issue is your father's credibility. If we expose him as having taught false information for 3 years, it doesn't just affect tomorrow's lecture. It calls into question everything he's taught, everyone he's influenced." "Good," David said harshly. "Maybe his credibility should be questioned." "David," I said gently, "he's still our father." "Is he?" "Because the father I thought I knew wouldn't have done this to his own daughter." Before anyone could respond, there was a soft knock on the conference room door. Amanda opened it to reveal my father standing in the hallway, his face haggard and his usual military bearing completely gone. "May I come in?" he asked quietly. "I think it's time we had a real conversation." Torres stood up. "Colonel, I don't think that's—" "Please," my father interrupted, his voice breaking slightly. "I need to hear the rest of it, all of it." David looked at me, silently asking for permission. I nodded slowly. "Come in, Dad. But this time, you're going to listen to the whole truth." My father entered the conference room like a man walking to his own execution. Gone was the commanding presence that had defined him for as long as I could remember. In its place was someone who looked fragile, uncertain, stripped of the authority that had been his identity for 40 years. He took the chair directly across from me, his hands folded carefully on the table. For several long moments, nobody spoke. The silence stretched between us, heavy with 7 years of unspoken truths and buried resentments. "The children," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me about the children." I studied his face, looking for signs of the man who had raised me, who had taught me about honor and duty, and doing what was right regardless of the cost. What I saw instead was a stranger wearing my father's features, someone I wasn't sure I recognized anymore. "The youngest was maybe 3 years old," I began, my voice steady despite the emotions churning beneath the surface. "A little girl with pigtails, playing with a ball in the courtyard of what intelligence had told us was an abandoned compound. She kept laughing every time the ball bounced too high for her to catch." My father's hands tightened slightly, but he didn't speak. "Her older brother was teaching her how to throw it properly. He couldn't have been more than 7, but he was so patient with her, so gentle. There was a grandmother hanging laundry on a line between 2 buildings, and 3 teenage boys working on what looked like a broken motorcycle." David shifted in his chair, and I could see Amanda wiping tears from her eyes, but I kept my attention focused on my father's face. When I saw them through the scope, I had maybe 30 seconds to decide. Follow orders and complete the mission, knowing those people would be killed, or abort and face whatever consequences came after. You chose to save them, my father said quietly. I chose to be the kind of soldier you taught me to be, I replied. The kind who remembers that our duty is to protect people, not sacrifice them for operational convenience. For the first time since entering the room, my father looked directly at me. Then why did you destroy me for it? I finished for him. Because admitting I was right would have meant admitting that the entire chain of command was wrong. That intelligence had failed, that mission planning had failed, that the officers who signed off on civilian casualties were failures. Torres leaned forward slightly. It would have meant admitting that the system made a mistake, Colonel, and in your experience, institutions don't like to admit mistakes. So you made the mistake instead, I continued. The insubordinate daughter, who couldn't follow orders, who cracked under pressure, who proved that some people just aren't cut out for military leadership. My father's face crumpled. Sarah, No, I said firmly. You don't get to speak yet. You wanted to hear the whole truth, so you're going to hear it. He nodded, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. After the review board recommended my dismissal, I thought you would fight for me. I thought my own father would look at the evidence and realize that I had done the right thing. Instead, you wrote a statement calling me mentally unfit for command. David's sharp intake of breath was audible across the room. You recommended that I be barred from any future military service, not just dismissed from active duty. You wanted to make sure I could never wear a uniform again, never serve my country in any capacity. I didn't know, my father started. You knew exactly what you were doing, I cut him off. Because 3 days after you signed that recommendation, Colonel Hawkins approached me. Do you know what she told me, Dad? He shook his head, looking genuinely confused. She told me that my case had caught the attention of certain elements within the intelligence community, that there were people who appreciated officers willing to make hard choices based on moral conviction rather than blind obedience. I paused, letting that sink in. She also told me that my father had specifically requested that I be blacklisted from any government employment, military or civilian. The color drained from my father's face. I never said that. Torres pulled out his phone again, scrolling to another document. Actually, Colonel, you did. Here's your written addendum to the review board's final report. I strongly recommend that Lieutenant Mitchell be prohibited from any future federal employment, as her demonstrated inability to follow lawful orders presents a security risk in any capacity requiring clearance or authority. My father stared at the phone screen, his lips moving silently as he read his own words from 7 years ago. Colonel Hawkins had to pull strings just to get me into the Phantom Division, I continued. She had to personally vouch for my character and convince her superiors that your assessment was wrong. Do you understand what that means, Dad? He looked up from the phone, confusion and horror warring on his features. It means that my commanding officer had more faith in me than my own father did. It means that a woman I'd never met was willing to risk her career to give me a second chance, while the man who raised me was actively working to ensure I never got one. The silence that followed was deafening. Amanda had her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. David looked like he wanted to hit something. Torres maintained his professional composure, but I could see the disgust in his eyes as he looked at my father. Why? David asked finally, his voice rough with emotion. Why would you do that to your own daughter? My father took a shuddering breath. Because I was angry. Angry that she had embarrassed me in front of my peers. Angry that she had questioned the judgment of officers I respected. Angry that she had made me look like I had raised a daughter who couldn't follow orders. So you destroyed her future to protect your reputation, David said flatly. I convinced myself that it was about maintaining discipline, about upholding the chain of command. But you're right. My father's voice broke completely. It was about my reputation, my career, my standing in the community. He looked directly at me then, and I saw something I had never seen before in his eyes, genuine remorse. I chose my pride over my daughter. I chose the approval of strangers over the welfare of my own child. And I've spent 7 years telling myself that it was justified, that you deserved what happened to you. Torres cleared his throat. Colonel, there's something else you need to know about tomorrow's lecture. My father turned to him with a questioning look. Colonel Hawkins will be in attendance. She's been invited as a guest observer by the War College commandant, who happens to be an old friend of hers. The implications hit my father immediately. She's going to expose me, publicly. She's going to tell the truth, Torres corrected. What happens to you after that depends entirely on what you choose to do in the next 12 hours. My father looked around the room, taking in the faces of his family, the disappointment and anger and hurt that he had created through his choices. "What do you want me to do?" he asked quietly. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of 7 years settling between us, like a wall that might never be fully torn down. "I want you to remember that little girl with the pigtails," I said. "I want you to remember that she's alive today because your daughter chose to disobey orders. And tomorrow morning when you stand in front of those officers, I want you to tell them the truth about what real leadership looks like." "Sarah," he said, his voice pleading, "can you ever forgive me?" I looked at this man who had shaped my understanding of honor and duty, who had taught me to value truth above comfort, who had then abandoned those principles when it became inconvenient to uphold them. "I don't know, Dad, but tomorrow you're going to have the chance to find out if you can forgive yourself." The War College auditorium held 300 seats, and everyone was filled. I sat in the back row, wearing my dress blues for the first time in 7 years, the weight of my actual rank insignia feeling foreign against my shoulders. Major Sarah Mitchell officially present and accounted for. Colonel Hawkins had made it possible with a single phone call the night before. "It's time," she'd said simply. "Time for you to stop hiding, and time for the truth to have its day in court." Now, watching my father adjust his notes at the podium, I wondered if he would have the courage to follow through with what we'd discussed until 3 in the morning. David sat beside me, still processing everything he'd learned. Amanda had chosen to stay home with their children, unable to bear watching what might unfold. Torres was seated in the front row, his presence both a support and a subtle warning. Next to him sat Colonel Hawkins herself, a small woman with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She nodded to me when I entered, a gesture of acknowledgement that carried 7 years of unspoken understanding. The War College commandant, General Patricia Rodriguez, stepped to the microphone first. "Ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to introduce Colonel James Mitchell, retired, one of our most respected guest lecturers. Colonel Mitchell has been sharing his insights on leadership challenges with our students for the past 3 years, and today's presentation promises to be particularly illuminating." My father stood slowly, his movement lacking the confident stride I remembered from my childhood. He looked older this morning, weathered by a sleepless night and the weight of decisions that could no longer be avoided. "Thank you, General Rodriguez," he began, his voice steady but subdued. "Today I was scheduled to present a case study titled, 'The Dangers of Insubordination When Personal Judgment Overrides Military Discipline.'" A murmur of anticipation ran through the audience. This was familiar territory for him, a lecture he'd delivered dozens of times to appreciative audiences of future commanders. "However," he continued, and I felt my pulse quicken, "I find myself compelled to present a different case study today. One titled, 'The Cost of Institutional Pride, When Leaders Choose Comfort Over Truth.'" The murmur changed tone, becoming one of confusion. In the front row, I saw Colonel Hawkins lean forward slightly, her attention completely focused on my father. "7 years ago," my father continued, "I participated in the review of an incident during a classified operation near the Pakistani border. A young lieutenant had disobeyed direct orders, potentially compromising a sensitive mission to secure suspected weapons caches." He paused, his eyes scanning the audience before finding mine in the back row. "For 3 years, I have used this case as an example of failed leadership, of what happens when personal feelings override military discipline. Today I want to tell you the real story." The auditorium had gone completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop among the 300 officers seated before him. The operation was designated as a training exercise to maintain plausible deniability. Intelligence reports indicated the target area was abandoned. The mission parameters called for immediate intervention upon arrival, regardless of ground conditions. My father's hands gripped the edges of the podium, knuckles white with tension. When the team arrived, they discovered 12 civilians in the target area, women, children, elderly individuals, who had taken shelter in what they believed was an abandoned compound. The lieutenant in charge had seconds to make a decision: follow orders and proceed with the mission, or abort to prevent civilian casualties. A colonel in the third row raised his hand. "Sir, what did the lieutenant do?" "She chose to abort the mission and evacuate the civilians," my father replied. "In doing so, she saved 12 innocent lives, including 5 children under the age of 10. "And the weapons cache?" another officer asked. "Was real and was successfully secured once the area was clear of civilians. The lieutenant's decision prevented a humanitarian disaster while still achieving the mission's primary objective." I could see confusion spreading through the audience. This wasn't the story they'd been expecting. Wasn't the cautionary tale about the dangers of questioning orders. "Sir," a major in the front row said, "if the lieutenant's actions were successful, why are you presenting this as a case study in failed leadership?" My father was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him struggling with words that had taken 7 years to find. "Because the review board, myself included, chose to classify her actions as insubordination rather than initiative. We chose to protect the institutional narrative that intelligence failures and flawed mission planning were not the problem. Instead, we made a scapegoat of the officer who had prevented a catastrophe." The auditorium erupted in whispers and murmurs. This was not what anyone had expected from a standard leadership lecture. General Rodriguez stood up from her seat in the front row. "Colonel Mitchell, are you saying that the review board deliberately mischaracterized this officer's actions?" "I am saying that we prioritized institutional reputation over truth. We prioritized the comfort of maintaining existing narratives over acknowledging that our systems had failed." Colonel Hawkins rose to her feet. "If I may, General Rodriguez, I believe I can provide some additional context." My father nodded to her, a gesture that looked like both permission and surrender. "The Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell is describing," Hawkins said, her voice carrying easily through the auditorium's sound system, "was recruited by my division 3 weeks after her dismissal. She has served with distinction in the Phantom Division for 7 years, currently holding the rank of major." The whispers became audible gasps. Several officers turned to look around the auditorium, as if trying to spot this mysterious major among them. "Furthermore," Hawkins continued, "Major Mitchell's approach to the situation Colonel Mitchell described has become the standard protocol for similar operations. Her decision-making process is now taught in our advanced tactical ethics courses as an example of proper leadership under impossible circumstances." A young captain near the middle of the auditorium raised her hand. "Ma'am, is this officer present today?" Hawkins looked directly at me. "Major Mitchell, would you please join us at the front?" The walk down the aisle felt like it lasted forever. Every eye in the auditorium followed my progress, taking in my uniform, my rank insignia, my very existence as living proof that everything they thought they knew about this story was wrong. When I reached the front, I turned to face the audience. 300 officers, representing every branch of service, every level of command experience, all staring at the woman who had supposedly failed at military leadership. "Major Mitchell," General Rodriguez said, "would you like to address the audience?" I looked out at the sea of faces, then at my father, standing beside the podium, then at Colonel Hawkins, who had given me a second chance when my own family wouldn't. 7 years ago, I made a decision that saved 12 civilian lives. Today, I want to talk to you about the decision I made yesterday. I could feel the attention in the room sharpen, everyone leaning forward to catch my words. Yesterday, I learned that my father has been using my case as an example of military failure for 3 years. He's been teaching future commanders that my choice to prioritize civilian lives over mission parameters was evidence of weak leadership and poor judgment. A lieutenant colonel in the second row shook his head in disbelief. "But here's what I want you to understand," I continued. "The most important decision I made wasn't on that battlefield 7 years ago. It was yesterday when I chose to forgive the man who had betrayed me in order to give him the chance to do what was right." I turned to look at my father, who had tears streaming down his face. Leadership isn't about never making mistakes. It's about having the courage to acknowledge when you've failed, to take responsibility for the harm you've caused, and to do everything in your power to make things right. The auditorium was completely silent now, the kind of profound quiet that comes when people are witnessing something transformational. Colonel Mitchell spent 7 years believing that protecting institutional pride was more important than protecting the truth. Today, he chose differently. Today, he chose to be the leader he always taught me to be, even when it cost him everything he thought mattered. I paused, looking out at the audience of officers who would soon be making their own impossible decisions in impossible circumstances. The lesson here isn't about following orders or questioning authority. It's about remembering that our ultimate duty is to the people we serve, not to the institutions we serve within. It's about understanding that sometimes, the most courageous thing a leader can do is admit they were wrong. I walked over to where Torres sat in the front row. He had something in his hand, something he'd been carrying since the night before. Sergeant Major Torres served under Colonel Mitchell in Afghanistan. He's been keeping something that belongs to me. Torres stood and handed me a small wooden box. Inside, nestled in blue velvet, was a Silver Star medal. "This was awarded to me last year," I said, holding the medal up for the audience to see. "For actions taken during a classified operation that prevented civilian casualties in a combat zone. The same type of decision I made 7 years ago, the same type of decision that Colonel Mitchell taught me, was a failure of leadership." I walked back to where my father stood and handed him the medal. "Dad, I want you to have this, not because you deserve it, but because I need you to remember what real honor looks like." My father took the medal with shaking hands, his voice breaking as he spoke. "Sarah, No more apologies," I said gently. "Just be better. Be the father I needed 7 years ago, and be the leader these officers need today." I turned back to the audience one final time. "That little girl with the pigtails that I told you about? She's 10 years old now. She's learning to read, learning to write, learning to dream about her future. She's alive because someone chose to disobey an order." I could see officers throughout the auditorium wiping tears from their eyes. When you're out there making the hard decisions, when you're choosing between following orders and following your conscience, I want you to remember her. Remember that leadership isn't about being right all the time. It's about being willing to do what's right, even when no one will thank you for it. The applause started slowly, just a few officers in the back, then spread like wildfire through the auditorium. 300 military leaders rose to their feet, applauding not for a perfect leader, but for the courage to tell an imperfect truth. As the ovation continued, my father stepped up to the microphone one last time. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice steady for the first time all morning, "I present to you Major Sarah Mitchell, my daughter, and the finest officer I have ever known." Later, as the auditorium emptied and officers approached to shake my hand and ask questions, I found myself standing with my father near the podium where his lecture materials lay scattered and forgotten. "Paz, do you think they'll ever trust me to teach again?" he asked quietly. "I think," I replied, "that today might have been the most important lesson you've ever taught." He nodded slowly, then looked at the Silver Star still clutched in his hands. "I don't deserve this." "No," I agreed, "you don't. But that little girl with the pigtails does. And every time you look at it, I want you to remember that she's alive because your daughter was brave enough to be the person you raised her to be, even when you forgot who that was." David appeared at my shoulder, his arm going around me in a gesture of support and pride. "So what happens now?" he asked. I looked around the auditorium, at the officers still engaged in animated discussions about leadership and moral courage, at Colonel Hawkins speaking quietly with General Rodriguez, at Torres packing away the evidence of 7 years of institutional lies. "Now," I said, "we go home, and we figure out how to be a family again." My father was quiet for a moment, then spoke with a humility I'd never heard from him before. Would you both like to have dinner tonight?" "At the house. I'll cook." David looked at me questioningly. I thought about 7 years of silence, 7 years of believing I'd failed, 7 years of carrying the weight of secrets that shouldn't have been necessary. Then I thought about a little girl with pigtails who was alive to see her 10th birthday, because sometimes the most important thing a soldier can do is choose love over orders. "Yeah, Dad," I said, "I'd like that." And for the first time in 7 years, Colonel James Mitchell smiled at his daughter with genuine pride. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.